Hello, I'm Ecem and I'm studying architecture at the Daniels faculty. Today I'm very honored to be presenting you Futureproof, Building Typology of the Future Analyzed from the COVID-19 lens. So let's get started. The world is still in the midst of a pandemic that has spread wider and faster than any in human history, affecting families, communities, and nations across the globe. In such a time, it is essential to learn how to improve our buildings and cities to be more adaptive and resilient to future crises. This project will provide its readers a guide on pandemic responses, adaptive architecture, and future-proofing through three main processes: analysis of changing architecture due to COVID-19, synthesis of research to create a COVID-19 building typology, and lastly, evaluation of the building typology and how it might look in the future. And let's go to analysis. Having started showing significant effect around March 2020, governments all around the world had to take extensive measures in order to manage the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result of these drastic changes, people's lifestyles had to shift accordingly, from physical health to social interactions. So how did our way of living change? We had lockdowns and closure of public spaces. We started working from home and remote learning. We started communicating online. We had travel restrictions and limited mobility. And lastly, we had to wear personal protective equipment while going out. And all of these changes led 62% of respondents to adopt some type of lifestyle change since the pandemic began, whether that's been getting more exercise, making positive dietary changes, or trying to get more sleep. And this new lifestyle meant new needs from architecture and new responses. With a rapidly changing environment, we had to take fast action to fulfill those needs. Therefore, these needs were not only essential, but they were also under a time constraint, which highlights the importance of preparedness for a crisis. And the first need I listed was speed. The need to design and build fast in emergency situations has been highlighted with the pandemic. The demand for more facilities like hospitals, quarantine centers, testing sites, and temporary lodgings increased as the healthcare industry became overwhelmed. And the possible solution to that was modular construction and adaptive reuse. So modular construction is the process where buildings are assembled through prefabricated modules. And similarly, adaptive reuse is the reuse of existing structures to serve new purposes. And other examples similar to these were pop-up recovery units that are rapidly deployable, or shipping containers converted to biocontainment pods, and modular critical care units that can be easily transported. The next one was social distancing. And the possible solution to social distancing itself was to include it in the design proposal. For example, Studio-Pract proposed a social distance-oriented park, allowing people to be outdoors. So instead of people social distancing themselves, the park is built and designed to be that way. And this offers spaces of refuge and serenity in urban areas, even during the pandemic. And the next one was adaptability. So flexible design has proven to be essential, whether that's reorganizing one's home better suited for working remotely or creating makeshift emergency facilities. And in this example here, the rooms can be changed with shifting walls and screens. So you can either use it as private rooms or a communal space. And the last one was connection. So the need to form connections with people, nature, and surroundings is more desired than ever. So instinctively, we can include more green spaces indoors to give us a sense of freshness, health, and tranquility. So what is future-proofing? Future-proofing is designing something so that it can still be used in the future, even when technology changes. So why is future-proofing important? Future-proofing techniques are used in architecture for more resilient buildings and cities. Buildings that are future-proof are often more adaptable and sustainable. With future-proof cities, we can be more prepared for future crises and lessen the possible damages to our buildings, communities, and cities. So, looking at the pandemic architecture typology, we can list some architecture approaches. Self-sufficient strategies. In addition to all energy-efficient strategies with heating and cooling systems, architects might inspire additional methods of thinking concerning water supply and food production. Be focusing on green spaces, low-rise buildings, So during a pandemic, it is necessary to reduce contact with everything in multi-story buildings such as elevators, door handles, and surfaces, and lastly, better air quality and ventilation. And possible strategies for that include adaptive reuse, modular construction, lightweight architecture, and healthy buildings. And there's been several examples throughout the pandemic that have been built according to these strategies. And to look at a specific case study, this is a case study from Mass, which looks at achieving infection control principles while offering solutions that allow people to safely come together by looking at the senior housing. And by looking at this case study, we can apply them to our current and future buildings. So some of these lists, for instance, the check-in system, to have a checking in visitors to aid contact tracing if an infection is discovered in the building, decontamination at the package desk, having individual mailboxes, limiting the elevator use and using more stairs. And this case study has applications for housing, for example, the containment space. So the containment space creates a permeable zone that commingles the exterior and interior. To pandemic-proof residential buildings, buffer or containment space needs to be established between the uncontrollable external world and the internal personal universe. Similarly, the threat-reduced internal residential space includes space suitable for self-isolation and communal spaces accessible to visitors. Spaces like these were high in demand during the start of the pandemic, essentially individual houses rather than apartments. And lastly, the spatial and social distancing within the house. So this image kind of labels the high-risk and low-risk areas within the home. Looking at these examples, we can derive some best practices we can use during a pandemic and possibly in the future. So design for social distance and not social isolation for common areas. Reduce congestions and reliance on waiting rooms and other communal spaces where infectious and healthy people mix. Sequence the flows of people to limit unnecessary overlaps. And make sure to separate clean and dirty entrances, ensure proper donning and doffing areas for PPE, and consider how people and materials will be moving through the space. Next one is rethinking material selection and treatment of surfaces. So surfaces contaminated with infected droplets can transmit disease. So we need to rethink guidelines determined by previous diseases in the face of new realities. As I previously mentioned, we need to make our spaces breathe better with ventilation and having lots of areas for fresh air to let in. Temporary shelters are never temporary. So we have instinctive responses to the pandemic, as I previously mentioned. However, these temporary solutions can have a long-term effect on the building's functions or the way we build in the future. So we need to keep in mind how temporary spaces and buildings might affect us in the longer term. And lastly, design for people and not just against pathogens. So also be ensured to keep in mind the people using the space and make sure that is accessible. And looking into the future, so even though the pandemic has made us change our way of living at the time, it will most definitely impact the way we design our buildings in the future. This will also have an obvious impact on the way we live in cities. Therefore, it is important to look into the ways architecture could change after the pandemic. So below are some questions this project looked into, answered by professionals, architects. So the changes in architecture not only affect construction, but also cities. Therefore, it's important to think about the urban effects and approaches to possibly future-proof our cities with adaptable, sustainable, and resilient architecture. So some urban approaches are expanding horizontally. And regarding the impact of social distancing, planners and architects might design according to expanding horizontally approaches with more available open spaces, which could be essential to prevent the spread of infections and diseases. Fewer density cities. So urbanization might take a step back to enhance villages and city suburbs, particularly with the increased acceptance of digital transformation. Decentralization. The pandemic highlights the importance of distributing smaller units such as health facilities, schools, and services across more of the urban tissue and strengthen local centers. A project related to this is actually the 15-minute city, The project claims that you should be able to reach every facility you need within a 15-minute radius. And urban farming, it is urgent to rethink how land is used with landscapes and urban farming integrated approaches. And lastly, fewer cars, more cycling and walking. So for instance, in the 15-minute city, you should be able to reach everywhere either by cycling and walking rather than using carbon-producing vehicles. So the lessons learned is that it's not possible for us to remake everything in our cities. However, as our world becomes more interconnected, we need to utilize new options that are more responsive, holistic, and flexible to better address the pandemic. Utilizing these options will also help us tackle other urgent issues like migration, social disconnection, inequality, climate change, pollution, and much more. In order to address such complex issues, we need to improve our ways of building and planning. I believe the pandemic was a good opportunity for us to reconsider our preparedness for crises in our cities. COVID-19 reminded us that if we prepare our cities according to possible crises, we can lessen the damages made to our communities. So, we should be more protective instead of reactive, and this is why we need future-proofing. Thank you.